great to be here with all of you and to talk about these issues. One of the great problems that Brad and I oftentimes have is that we wind up fighting in the trenches about things that never wind up in the newspaper for one reason or another. And so to have a chance to talk with you directly about it and how we can work together to be more effective is really, really important. And Deanna's been very effective at representing you coming into the community and as well to the State House and talking to us. And it was my suggestion that this group be joined by the community, because what I would suggest to you, just anecdotally, is that the greatest failure to reform education in a meaningful way is from the inability to form meaningful coalitions among communities that share the same interests. And so by doing this, I think you're advancing that cause significantly. In terms of where education stands in the current fiscal year, one thing that we have been trying to do to overcome the problem that was created largely in 2002 and 2003 when we had some cuts in order to balance the budget, because we in the Commonwealth were in a difficult fiscal situation, is to try to adopt a 5-year plan, not only to gain some ground in terms of what we lost, but also to reduce the differences between like communities. And I noticed one of the charts that was given out today, I don't know if everyone has it, but we have it, talks about the differences in spending on education between North Reading and some peer communities. And one of the things that we embarked on 2 years ago was a 5-year plan. Go ahead.
I have.
Here, let's
okay.
Should I give it out now? And
sure, why
I was
not?
going to talk to this actually in the open session, but I don't have enough to go around, so please share with your neighbors.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you.
Well, while you're doing that, let me just say that one of the things we tried to do is embark on a 5-year plan to be able to reduce some of those inequities between like communities. Let me tell you right up front, I don't like the Chapter 70 formula. I didn't like it when I was a member of the House, and for that reason I voted against the Education Reform Act of 1993. And I have spent almost every year since then trying to change some element of the formula or repeal the formula itself. I don't like it, I didn't like it then, and I don't like it now. And I think it needs substantial change. Getting to that change has been very, very difficult. But for right now, we're on a 5-year plan, and that 5-year plan requires significant expenditures of money. And so this year, the appropriation that's required to stay on track for year 3 of the plan is approximately $223 million. That's what's in the local aid resolution that's been agreed to by the governor and the House and the Senate. Beyond that, we still have a lot of work to do. And one of the things that I noticed was mentioned is the issue of special education, which is an enormous issue that I would suggest to you that we need to address. I would point out that prior to having the circuit breaker, which was adopted now a number of years ago, what the state did for special education was a 50-50 cost share on your outplaced students. And generally speaking, in the last year of that program, and I'm talking about rough numbers, so you might find I'm a few dollars off, but roughly speaking, we were spending about $50 million on that program. When we adopted circuit breaker, ultimately that number shot up by a factor of 4 to over $200 million. And so we did make significant progress, and the progress was not only in the dollar amount, it was programmatic. Because before circuit breaker, if you outplaced, you got some state assistance. If you didn't get state assistance. Now there's still a problem with this, and that's because the formula, in my opinion, for circuit breaker still favors outplaced students. If you keep your students in the system, you still are at a disadvantage. But that being said, when we adopted circuit breaker, we at least moved to a placement neutral, at least on its face, system. Now the big debate about transportation being in the circuit breaker is an important one, because we all know the cost of transportation oftentimes exceeds the cost of tuition for an outplaced student. So there's 2 schools of thought in the legislature on how we might get at that. One is to include transportation costs in circuit breaker. The other thought about how to modify circuit breaker is to lower the threshold for reimbursement. Currently you have to reach 4 times foundation budget per student, for an individual student, before you're eligible. There is a school of thought that we should reduce that number to 3 times foundation budget. And that would help to pick up more of the included students because they're less likely to spike in the cost. We debate that. I doubt we're going to see any significant change in that this year. However, I will tell you that one of the things that we've been doing is looking at in my office and with others, and I know that Brad has been very, very supportive of trying to maximize federal reimbursement. We think that we are being under-reimbursed substantially by the federal government for the cost of Medicaid services provided to our kids in the school system. A couple of years ago, Auditor DiNucci released a report, and the report discussed the billing system that we use. And Dan and I have actually had a chance to talk about this in the office, but Auditor DiNucci said that essentially there are two ways that states can bill the federal government for Medicaid. They're basically, the difference between them is the amount of effort that you put into reporting the cost. So one is a per day rate, and another one is a per service rate, the per service rate being the higher level of information. Apparently we are in the vast minority of states that use the per day rate. And the consequence of that, according to the auditor, conservatively speaking, could be an under-reimbursement of about $50 million. So last year in the budget, we proposed that we seek to recapture those dollars, or to capture those, and put them into sped transportation. We're going to continue to move forward on that. The problem right now is that the folks at the Department of Education and the folks that deal with our Medicaid program have indicated they are trying to change to that system, and the federal government is resisting that attempt to change. And so we've got to take that to a little bit different level, and we're going to make an appeal either, certainly next month, with our federal legislative delegation to say, please let us make that change so we can gain those additional dollars. Other than that, I don't see at this point too much change that we might hope for in terms of the amount of dollars. Now, I certainly understand the need for an increase in Chapter 70, and I'll tell you why. When we talk about the issue of not being at the same level we're at in '02, those numbers are adjusted for inflation. And if we don't adjust for inflation, there are still many communities that aren't at the level they were at in '02 or '03. Now, to fix that problem, to bring them up to where they were, there's about 97 communities right now that fit in that category. To fix that problem cost about $31 million. Now, the problem I have is when we look at the governor's budget, his House 2 budget proposal, he embarks on a number of new spending initiatives, and many of them are laudable. They're things that, in fact, we've already talked about in this discussion, and the discussion is very early. Things about full-day kindergarten and other kinds of things. Those are laudable. But my point and my position is we shouldn't embark on new spending programs until we can meet the commitments we've already made. And I would suggest to you we are not meeting those new commitments. So one of the potential issues that exists out there is whether that new spending that's in the governor's budget is really sustainable. And that's a big issue now, particularly since we don't have the gaming revenue that his budget was predicated on. But if those things are real, then I would suggest to you we ought to be re-examining our priorities and say we ought to put money into the schools and into our basic K through 12 programs before we try to expand programs. So where I see education in the budget and in the next fiscal year is continuing to be a priority. State government has had some real strong fiscal challenges in the last couple of years, and believe me, '09 is going to be an even greater challenge than anyone is expecting right now. And '10 is going to be very difficult. But notwithstanding that, the legislature has kept its commitment to year 1 and year 2, and we're going to keep our commitment to year 3 of spending. And something that I know that Brad has been a real champion of, so I'll only touch upon it, is we're also going to backfill the lottery. The lottery is not going to meet its objectives either for this year or for next year, and '10 is questionable as well. But we have used other sources of revenue to keep cities and towns whole, because the lottery belongs to cities and towns. And we're going to continue to do that. And I would give Brad credit because he also tried to find some additional dollars to go out to cities and towns. We failed with that initiative, but we're going to keep trying. Welcome, Doctor. We're going to try to continue to hammer away at that issue, that when the state had difficulties in '02 and '03, we withheld lottery money. It's owed to the cities and towns. We ought to give it to them so that we can afford it. So I see education as being continuously being a priority. I think it has for almost as long as I've been in the legislature. In fact, I think it's been as long as I've been in the legislature. Where I see the real problem, if we want to get to the nub of the issue, is it's not the amount of money we put in at the top of the page for education spending. It's the mechanisms we use to get that money to the cities and towns. And in terms of, I know another issue that's very important is trying to have an adequacy study to look at that mechanism, because it doesn't work. It doesn't account for the sped kids that don't become eligible for circuit breaker. It doesn't fully account for the cost of energy. It doesn't fully account for wages. It's got a number of problems. And hopefully this year we can finally get the adequacy study that everyone's wanted so that we can at least look and see if what we're projecting education spending ought to be is realistic. I would suggest to you it isn't. But I'd also suggest to you the leadership is very leery of having that adequacy study done, because the fear is it's going to reveal that we need to spend somewhere between $500 and $800 million more per year than we're spending right now. And they're very leery of having that number on the table. So I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Bruce answered all the questions, so.
Well, I just want to add,
This is my second visit this year, so.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask a question about your relationship or your knowledge of the new Secretary of Education and his efforts to coordinate, the pre-K through college. We looked, online at the governor's website. He talks about his readiness program projects. He mentions, this, when I counted it up, there was about 186 members, there's 13 subcommittees. There's a lot of people.
And there's a lot of secrecy and cloaks, so people don't know what's going on the way they should. It creates tremendous concern, because I, like Bruce, agree that I think when you see his plan committee, he's going to talk about a whole bunch of initial add-ons and new ideas and new things like that. And my quote's always been, my community's not concerned about educational add-ons, they're concerned about educational core right now. They want to get back to that point and say, when we're living up, just what Bruce said 2 minutes ago, when we're meeting our obligations that we've currently made in an adequate way, then we can talk about maybe what are the additional pieces we want to put on. It's somewhat funny because we've been hearing a lot about process, particularly the last couple of weeks after the state house, the gaming issue. We're talking about open process and so on and so on. And I would say the governor is engaged in the readiness project and quite the opposite. Usually the press isn't allowed in to see what's going on, and it creates a challenge to know exactly what's being talked about and what the direction's going to be. But I have concerns for what's going to be in the year. In order to fund those things, it means there's not necessarily going to be funding to go back into these areas.
All right, well, moving, I guess, a little bit, although the next question we do have is again about the foundation formula and how these are engaged. The July 1 session's coming up, and, I guess the urgency is our concern, the urgency around that, and you mentioned that you think it's there, and that's great, because we really appreciate that. And, however, has anybody looked into other states, what they do, like you said, there's any chance that any type of advocacy can be done, or, to check this out, to test this out, to see what other options we have?
I would say that there's a number of pieces of legislation. One that I was a co-sponsor of was Senate 291. Bruce, I think, had a bill with the Republican colleagues in the Senate. There's a variety, about a dozen that all had sort of